So welcome to this week's Optimal Health Clinic Facebook Live. And firstly, before I get into the subject of this week's session, just to let you guys know that we're going to be doing some work over the coming weeks to better archive and organize the sessions that we've done to date. There must be well over 50 of these Facebook Lives that I've done since January last year. And we're starting to hear that it's become quite a resource for people. So we're going to try and do a better job. I think we're going to try and have a library of the sessions that have been done somewhere on the website, theoptimalhealthclinic.com. We're also going to number the sessions and just try and help you guys have it as a kind of, searchable resource to find information that is supportive. We're also going to be having more of the practitioner team this year. We're going to come into doing some of these sessions. We want to play with doing some kind of interview type pieces. So potentially talking to patients that have recovered or patients on the kind of recovery path about some of their lessons and some of their experiences as well. So yeah, just letting you know, we're going to play with some things. Feel free to comment. I feel like I'm getting more and more last minute in terms of my my plan to do these sessions. So I'm definitely keen to have ideas, topics that you guys would like covered. So feel free either to email my assistant Grace, which is grace@theoptimalhealthclinic.com, with any ideas you've got. That's probably the most surefire way to make sure that it gets seen. I do try and look at the comments as well. But yeah, if you've got suggestions, let us know. So for this week's session, I wanted to talk about types of tiredness. And actually, the origin for this was I was working with a patient this morning, and they mentioned the session that we'd done on Secrets to Recovery a number of years ago around this. Called 3 Types of Tiredness, and I haven't actually had a chance to go and remind myself of the content, but I'm pretty sure that 3 of those are in the 4 here. But what I've done is actually linked these types of tiredness to types of anxiety, may I say, to types of tiredness. Because one of the things that you find is that there's a phrase that I often use: if you can see it, you don't have to be it. So the more you can identify what's happening, and for example, in this instance, the type of anxiety that you're experiencing, the more able you are to then find effective intervention to help and to change that. And actually this afternoon, I was having a meeting with Anne Dashinsky, who was the original Director of Psychology at Optimal Health Clinic. We were talking about, we were having a kind of like trip down memory lane of remembering the inception of some of the pieces of the Optimal Health Clinic psychology model. And remembering that these different things like types of tiredness and stages of recovery and subtypes, that these were maps and models that emerged from us working with patients and talking about what happened, reflecting on our own recovery paths, and starting to, in a sense, piece together a jigsaw that gave more clarity and more understanding to what's happening. And then if you've got that map, that then helps you, it's almost like if you're trying to navigate from point A to point B, and then you get a bit lost along the way, if you have the map, you can find out where you are on the map, and then you can find your way out of that. So these maps become really helpful, and these maps come from experience. The more you can map where you are, often it helps calm down anxiety pattern about where you are, but it also helps you see the path out of that. So, and by the way, if you can hear a dog barking in the background, we just got a puppy. So I think Wednesday night Facebook Lives might not be quite as quiet as they sometimes are, but anyway. So 4 types of tiredness, 4 types of anxiety linked to 4 types of tiredness. So physical anxiety. Physical anxiety is, there's a few examples of what can cause it, one of which is low blood sugar. So if you have issues around blood sugar and you have a meal without enough protein, or you're late to have a meal, and for some people even there's just gaps, the gaps between meals can trigger it. That's where you get a feeling of being kind of hungry and jittery, which tends to be settled or soothed by having food, particularly by having high protein food. We can have physical anxiety through a crash. So if we run out of normal energy, so our mitochondria crash, one of the things you'll notice is that you have your kind of adrenals start pumping to compensate, and then you get an anxiety pattern. So almost like the deeper we go into a crash, the more anxiety we can start to experience. And that's our body simply trying to compensate by pumping adrenaline. Our hormones can play an issue. So if we have hormone issues, you can take or not take hormones, and that can have an impact. Or if you need to be taking some kind of support for your adrenals or your thyroid and you're not, that can have an impact. If it's physical anxiety, often rest is very important. If you just rest the system, that will help. If there are physical imbalances, or if you need to eat, or if you need to understand what's happening, those pieces can be crucially important. But sometimes people can say, why have I got such bad anxiety? When I'm using all the psychology tools, I don't feel like I'm inherently anxious as a person. It is absolutely the case that you can have full-blown anxiety, the physical manifestation, the thoughts that go with it, the feeling of not being safe that goes with it, and it is absolutely physical in origin, and the correction is physical. And that doesn't mean that the various tools we teach on the psychology side won't help. They can still be very helpful, but the kind of the origin of the trigger is a physical origin or trigger. Emotional anxiety is where we go into a state of emotional overwhelm. So it's not so much, emotional anxiety might be the wrong phrase. It's anxiety which is triggered by being in a state of emotional overwhelm. And that can be where we have more feelings than we know how to deal with or process. That can be historical feelings that have been unprocessed or coming up, or it can be things that are happening in our life now. We might be going through a difficult life experience, like perhaps someone we love has died, or we are just dealing with the reality of day-to-day life with ME, CFS and Fibromyalgia. But it's like so emotionally overwhelming that we can't really process it. And so in that instance, and I should, without wanting to go too deep into this, also when we're a child, if we don't get the emotional support we need to deal with our emotions, often the safe place we go to is in our head. So we go to our head to not feel. It's like if feelings happening in our heart, happening in our body, we go to our head to escape and to get away from it. And then we feel anxiety. It's almost like our nervous system kicks in to help us not feel our feelings. So that's what I would call emotionally triggered anxiety. We can have mental anxiety. I think Susan was saying that she thinks her anxiety is mental. So mental anxiety is where our mind is overstimulated. It's where there's too many thoughts that are happening. We may be playing mental tennis, where we're going backwards and forwards about, should I rest? Should I push myself? This is why I should rest. This is why I should push myself. It can be that we're doing what we call snowball thinking, where we start with a small thought and then it escalates and gets bigger and bigger. So that might be something like, we have a day we don't feel so great. And then we think of all the other days we've not felt so great. And then we think, and I'm never going to recover. And then think, if I never recover, how am I going to support myself and my family? And then think everyone's going to leave us. And before we know it, we're basically on our own, no money, no support, and our life's completely over. So I'm sure no one here has ever done that. But anyone that resonates with that, catastrophizing is what it's called in CBT. But snowball thinking, it gets too big. So there are different kind of forms of mental patterns, as we would refer to them, which create mental anxiety. Now, by the way, if you have physically induced anxiety, you will still have lots of mental thoughts. If you have lots of mental thoughts triggering anxiety, you will get a physical response. You will pump adrenaline, you will feel tense, your muscles will tighten, and all the things that go with anxiety. So whether it starts in your head, it starts in your heart, or it starts in your body, the overall experience is still the same. With emotional anxiety, we need to digest the emotions that are there. That could be through EFT, so through tapping. It could be through doing some NLP work around some of those emotions. It could be doing some psychotherapy work, it could be doing body psychotherapy. There are different ways to help digest emotions that are in our system. If it's mental anxiety, we need to stop the thought patterns. Things like the stop process. There's lots of tools and techniques that we teach to help do that. The fourth type of anxiety linked to types of tiredness is environmental anxiety. Funnily enough, if you spend too much time in the same environment, that in of itself can start to trigger anxiety patterns. Because the body, it's like we have a need for consistency, but we also have a need for change. And if everything's the same all the time, our mind starts to get busy almost in boredom. That if our life is constantly repetitive, nothing's ever changing, particularly if we're housebound or bedbound and we're seeing the same things, that in of itself can trigger our mind busying to try and avoid and get away from the situation. In that instance, ideally we would change the environment. If we're physically restricted so much that we can't, even changing things in the environment, be that if it's appropriate and there's not sensitivities, burning some incense, listening to some quiet music, changing lighting. So even in a restricted environment, changing things within those environments will tend to have a soothing, calming impact. A few people are asking, is it possible to have two? You can have all of these in any combination. You can have 1, 2, 3, 4, any which one. And normally what will happen is you will start with one and it may trigger others. So you may start with physical anxiety, like maybe you start with low blood sugar, you start to get mental anxiety, then the mental anxiety perpetuates the physical anxiety. So it starts to trigger more stress hormones, which then pushes your blood sugar more out. You can start with emotional anxiety, where you're overwhelmed emotionally, triggers physical anxiety, but also triggers mental anxiety. What I don't want you to do is do anxiety about types of anxiety. So like any map, treat this as a map, as a useful way of kind of understanding what's happening. If it's physical, address the physical the best you can. Be that making sure you eat, be that taking rest because your system's crashed, be it looking at hormones, whatever it may be. If it's emotional anxiety, look at digesting and processing the emotions. If it's mental anxiety, look at calming the mental patterns. Also meditation, mindfulness will be very helpful for that. And if it's environmental anxiety, look at creating some variety in the environment that you're in. Be patient. Yes, if you can see it, you don't have to be it. That will help you identify strategically what's going to be useful. But don't overthink it at the same time. It's interesting how often we try to think our way out of thinking. We have anxiety and we think if we worry and if we think enough about what we're worried about, that will find the solution. And I think I did a Facebook Live on this a while ago of talking about trying to give ourselves a sense of safety by thinking our way to safety. And rarely does that work. It's much better to calm and settle the system and then from that place to revisit what we're thinking about. So I hope that's been useful. I recognize there's a lot of information in this session. There's a lot of pieces that you could reference to help understand this. Things we've done around some of the emotions, some of these sessions, some stuff we've done on different anxiety patterns. So if you've got questions, dive into some of the other material and hopefully that could be useful. Sarah, hello Sarah, what's OHC? Could environmental anxiety be caused by overstimulation from noise, lighting, smells? Absolutely, that's a good point, Sarah, thank you. Yes, if you have too much stimulation in your environment, that could be turning on your maladaptive stress response. That's a really good point. So sometimes reducing stimulation in the environment will actually help your system settle and calm. So yeah, thank you, Sarah, for pointing that out. Thank you everyone for watching. Look forward to talking with you at some point between 6 and 7 next week. Bye-bye for now.